myself. My name is Chris Webb, and I work at Microsoft on the Power BI Customer Advisory team. And I am a big fan of Power Query. Power Query is the data transformation and data loading engine in Power BI, in Excel, and in lots of other Microsoft products as well. Now, the title of this presentation may be a little bit confusing. Even if you've used Power BI for a long time, you may be wondering what the data privacy settings are. So the first thing I'm going to do before I even talk about the agenda is tell you why this is important. Number one thing, have you ever seen these error messages before? These are the error messages that terrify any Power BI developer because they are very difficult to debug, they are very confusing, and in a lot of cases, they can stop you from doing what you need to do. So what we're going to do in this presentation is explain why these error messages occur and how to stop them happening in a safe way. The second thing is, you may be wondering, why do I need to care about data privacy? If you've not heard of this subject before, you may be thinking, well, this is an obscure subject in Power BI, and well, you know, who cares about this? The reason is this is a very important subject because you could lose your job if you don't pay attention to this. You could cause a lot of damage to your company. You could get into trouble with the law. Here is a headline from a blog of a security researcher's blog from 1 year ago. And the weakness that they're talking about here is not just Excel, but it's Power Query inside Excel. So remember, it is not an obscure topic. There are people out there already who are looking at this and understanding how Power Query works that may not have your best interests at heart. So this is a really important topic and one you need to understand if you are going to do any serious work in the Power Query editor in Power BI. So let's talk about what I will cover in this presentation. Data privacy settings control how data travels from one data source to another inside Power BI. So before we do anything else, we have to understand how Power BI determines what a data source is. Then we will have a look at the data privacy settings and what they mean, what all of the different options are, and where in the user interface you can change them. And then we will understand why they are so important, because we will look at how data can travel from one data source to another by looking at something called query folding inside Power Query. This will help us understand both types of data source, both types of error. But the second error that I had on that screen earlier, the more difficult one, needs a little bit more explanation. So we will need to look at how Power Query creates something called partitions within a query to control how data flows through. And then we'll be able to see how we can change our queries to work around the second error. And then finally, we will look at how data privacy works in the Power BI service for data sets and in particular for data flows. So to start at the beginning, data privacy settings are properties that are attached to data sources in the Power Query editor inside Power BI. But what is a data source? So a data source at the most general level is quite easy to understand. It is somewhere that you get data from when you're loading your data into Power BI. Now, that seems pretty straightforward, but it's important to understand that there are two ways that Power Query and Power BI understand what a data source is. There are two properties of a data source. A data source has a kind. So your data source could be an Excel workbook. It could be a SQL Server database. it could be a web service. So it is the type of data source. And secondly, a data source has a path. The path uniquely identifies the data source. So for example, if you were thinking about a SQL Server database, which was your data source, then the kind would be SQL Server, but the path would be the connection string. For example, you're connecting to localhost and the database AdventureWorks. If you were connecting to Excel, then the path would be the path used to connect to the XLSX file. Now, you can see the data sources that have been identified in the Power Query editor. Let me switch over to Power BI Desktop. Here is my demo Power BI file. And you can see that I've got lots of Power Query queries here ready to do a demo. If you want to see the data sources that you used in your Power BI file, you need to go to the Home tab in the Power Query editor, click on Data Source Settings, and here you will see two radio buttons up at the top. By default, you will see all of the data sources used in the current file. And if you click on one, let's click on this, you can edit permissions and you can see some properties, including the privacy level and information about the credentials. You will also see under global permissions a list of every single data source that you've connected to on your PC. So these Power Query remembers all of the data sources you've used. So the Power Query data privacy settings that we've seen are associated with a data source. The first problem that you may run into is that sometimes data sources do not appear in that data source settings dialog. Why? Well, it is possible in M code, if you're writing M to generate your queries, to dynamically generate the connection information used for a data source. For example, if you're passing data to a web service, you may be generating the parameters used, the data that's sent to that web service dynamically. And this means that in the Power Query editor, before the query is run, there is no way for the Power Query editor to know which data source you're connecting to. And if the Power Query editor can't know which data source you're connecting to before the query is run, you can't set a data privacy level for that data source. Now, there are various ways around this, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But if you ever go into this data source settings dialog, and on the data sources in current file, see the message, some data sources may not be listed because of hand-authored queries, you know that you have been dynamically generating some Power Query data sources in code. And when you see this, like I said, you will not be able to set the data source settings for them, and you may have a problem later on. Okay, so data privacy settings. Now, like I said, data privacy settings are very important, and they control how data moves from one data source to another. And we've also seen that data sources have a data privacy level associated with them. Now, by default, in the Power Query editor in Power BI, when a query is run, the Power Query engine checks these data privacy levels to see whether data is allowed to move from one data source to another. Now, if you've ever seen the errors that I showed you right at the beginning of this presentation, and you've struggled to get them to go away, you may have run a Bing search and found out that, well, one way to get rid of them is to turn off data privacy checks. So, to do this, if you go to the main Power BI window, you go to File, hold on, I need to close that dialog. So let's just get rid of that. Go to File, Options and Settings, Options. And there are two places that you need to go to turn off data privacy checks. Under Global, you will see that there are three options here. Now, the default is always combine data according to your privacy level settings. This means that data privacy checks are always applied for every single Power BI file on this PC. There is a second option, which means that you can turn off data privacy checks for individual Power BI files. That's what I've got selected here. If you have this selected, you can then go down to Current File, Privacy, and there are two more options that are lit up. So if you've got the ability to turn on and off data privacy checks for an individual file, you can either, for this particular file that we're in right now, either apply the data privacy checks, which I've got set here, or ignore them just for this particular file. The final option you have is to always ignore privacy level settings. I strongly recommend that you don't do this, because even if it makes your error go away, it will possibly cause you problems later on when you've published your Power BI dataset to the service. And as I said, in any case, this could result in data going to places you didn't want it to do. Now, assuming that you have your data privacy checks turned on, you will find that every data source has one of four possible values that it can be set to for its data privacy level: private, organizational, public, and none. And like I said, these are the settings that are used to control whether data is allowed to pass from one data source to another. Let's see what they mean. If you have data, if you have a data source which has its data privacy level set to private, that means that data cannot be sent to any other data source. If you have your data privacy setting set to organizational, that means that data from this data source can go to another data source, but only if it is public or organizational. Now, the private setting is useful for the most sensitive data that you have. In a lot of cases, though, organizational will be okay. Because, for example, if you're sending data from one data source inside your company to another data source inside your company, and the data is never leaving your company or organization, then that's probably okay. You're not sending sensitive data outside your company. You're probably not breaking any rules. The third setting you've got is public, and data from public data sources can be sent to any other data source. Finally, there is a data privacy setting called none. And none just means that you have not set a privacy level for this data source yet. If you have none set, two things may happen. You may find that when you run your query, a prompt appears that tells you have to choose the privacy setting for this data source, or you may find that the setting is inherited from another data source. What this means. Let's close this. Let's open the Power Query Editor window, and we go to data source settings. So you can change the privacy level here in the data source settings dialog by changing the privacy level here. At the moment, this is set to public. Now you will notice here that I've got another data source here. This is the root URL for a web service provided by the UK government that allows me to search for open data. This is a particular endpoint. So there are multiple endpoints here. Now, if I click Edit Permissions, you can see that at the moment this is set to public. If I didn't set this privacy level, if I had it set to none, then because I've set a data privacy level here on the root of the URL, this would be inherited by this particular data source. The same thing could happen with a SQL Server database. So here I've got a database which is the AdventureWorks DW database on my local SQL Server. If I had a data source which was just localhost and I'd set a data privacy level there, and this data source had a data privacy level of set to none, then I would inherit the data source from the localhost data source. So it can be quite confusing when this happens, but it just means that you'll be prompted less often to set the data privacy level. Now, the rules that I've just talked about mean that control how data gets sent from one data source to another. And if we're talking about any two data sources, we can say whether they are compatible or not. Now, compatible means that data can be sent from one data source to another. So, for example, if I have two data sources where the data privacy level is set to public, they are compatible. That means that data from that one public data source can be sent to another public data source. If I have two data sources and one is public and one is private, then they are not compatible because I cannot send data from the private data source to the public data source. So we have this idea that these rules control whether data can be sent from one data source to another. If data can be sent, you have no need to worry. If data can't be sent, that's when problems can start to occur. You may find that performance gets worse. You may find that you start to see those error messages that I just showed. Now, the next thing to talk about, and maybe something that you've been wondering already, is when does data get sent from one data source to another? Because surely in Power BI, I will never be sending data from one data source to another. All I'm doing is loading data from my data sources into Power BI. So, if I have an Excel file and a SQL Server database and I'm loading data from them into Power BI, when does data get sent from one data source to another? Surely that would never happen. Well, in some cases, it will happen. And to understand this, you have to understand something called query folding in Power Query. Query folding describes how the Power Query engine can optimize certain transformations that you do. It's only possible for some data sources like relational databases or analysis services or OData. But what it means is that when you're building a query in the Power Query editor, instead of getting all of the data from the data source and then applying the transformations inside the Power Query editor, query folding, when it takes place, means that the Power Query engine is able to take some or all of your transformations and push them back to the data source. So again, let's see how this works. I have a query here that connects to the dim date table in my local SQL Server database in the AdventureWorks database. It has 4 steps. I am connecting to my instance. I am going to the dim date table in the AdventureWorks DW27 database. And then you can see here in this step called navigation, I've got all of the columns in dim date. I am removing the columns that I don't want. So I've just selected 4 columns here. And then you can see in English day, name of week, I have lots of different days of the week. I'm going to filter this down so that I only have the days which are Friday. So the important thing here is I've connected to a table in SQL Server. I've selected only 4 columns and I've applied a filter to the rows. Now in this case, I know that query folding is going to take place. And I can actually see the SQL query that covers all of those transformations by right-clicking on filtered rows and selecting this View Native Query option here. For SQL Server and for most other relational databases, this allows me to see the SQL query that's been generated when this query runs. And you can see from the SQL query that Power Query is not selecting all of the columns in the table. It knows that I've got a step that says just select these 4 columns. So only these 4 columns are included in the select clause. And then it knows that I have another step that says only select the days that are Friday. So I have a where clause here that applies this filter on Friday. Now, in other cases, query folding could take place, and you will find that query folding, that View Native Query option is not visible. So you may need to look in the query diagnostics to see what's going on. But for SQL Server databases and for this demo, it's very easy to see where the query folding is taking place. Now, how does data privacy affect query folding? It can have 2 possible impacts. It may stop query folding from taking place and then hurt performance, or it may stop query folding from taking place and then cause an error because it stops the query being run. So let's see 2 possible scenarios. I will go through some slides to describe them, and then I will show you a demo that shows them as well. So let's imagine a scenario where I have got 2 data sources. I've got an Excel worksheet, and on that Excel worksheet, I have a table, the table that I'm showing here. And in that table, I've got a column called day. And in that column, there is one value, which is Tuesday. So let's imagine that I have a query that reads the data from this table and returns just this value Tuesday. Now, remember that query that I ran in SQL Server just then? Well, that query filtered the English day name of week column by the value Friday. That Friday value was hard-coded. Wouldn't it be good if we could read the name of the day of the week that we want to use to filter the dim date table from our Excel spreadsheet? Well, we can do that. If that happens, and data privacy allows it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read that Tuesday value from Excel. I'm going to load it into the Power Query engine inside Power BI. And that day name will be injected into the where clause of the SQL query that I run against my date table to get just the rows which are Tuesday. So query folding takes place, but what's happened? Well, this value Tuesday, this is data that's come from one data source, and because query folding took place, it has been sent to another data source, the SQL Server database. Now, in this case, nobody cares about the day name Tuesday. But what happens if you were working with more sensitive data? Perhaps you had a list of people who were ill with some rare disease. Perhaps there's a pandemic going on, and perhaps you have a list of people who have got this terrible disease, and you want to plot where those people live on a map in Power BI, so you can see whether there are groups of people within a particular area who have the disease. So the list of people who has this disease is very sensitive. You cannot send that outside your organization. So you load it into Power BI. You want to be able to plot where they live on a map. So you connect to a web service that takes addresses and returns a latitude and longitude that you can plot on a map. Well, in that situation, if this is an external web service outside your organization, in order to take your patients' addresses and turn them into latitudes and longitudes, you have to send those addresses to a web service. Well, guess what? You've just sent data, sensitive data outside your organization. So this shows how dangerous query folding could be. Now, obviously, it's not dangerous in all cases. And in a lot of cases, you want query folding to take place because it gives you good performance. If we go back to the Power Query editor here, I have a query that does exactly what I've just said. So here within this query, what I'm doing is I'm actually referencing a query up here called day name value. And this day name value query connects to an Excel workbook, goes to a table and grabs the value Monday. And then here in this dim date query, this is similar to the query that I just showed you up here, but in the last step, which filters the rows, see if you look at the M, instead of hard coding the name of the day of the week, I'm referencing the name of this day name value query. So I'm doing what I just described, filtering the names in the rows in dim date by a value taken from Excel. Now, at the moment, if we look at the data sources, the data for these two things, so we look up here for AdventureWorks, that's set to public, and we look at the selected day data source, that's set to public. Public data sources are compatible. I can send data from one data source to another. So I right click on filtered rows, view native query, and we can see that query folding is taking place because the SQL query run here contains that value Monday. Now, what happens if I change the data privacy level for this data source to private? Well, remember, with a private data source, I am not allowed to send data from one data source to another. In this situation, if we walk through on the slide, we can get the data from the private data source and load it into the Power Query engine. So that's okay. But the thing I'm not allowed to do is to use that to construct a SQL query with a where clause that filters by that day name. So if I set the Excel data source to private, the query will still run successfully, but instead what the Power Query engine will do is it will run a query that gets everything, every row from the date table, and then it will apply that filter inside the Power Query engine to only get the rows which were Tuesdays. So in this situation, when the data sources are not compatible, query folding does not take place. The query will probably be slower as a result, but the query will still run. So if I go back to here, go to data source settings, choose my selected day data source, click on edit permissions and set this to be private and click close. And I refresh this just to make sure. You'll see the query runs. We're not working with much data here, so it's still going to be quite fast. But if I right click here, you'll see that view native query is grayed out. So that where clause with where English day name of week equals Monday, that is not created anymore. And the filtering to get just the Monday rows happens inside the Power Query editor. There is another possibility with incompatible data sources. So if you have incompatible data sources, it could be that your query cannot run at all. Let's consider another scenario. So let's say that we are still getting data from that Excel spreadsheet, but now instead of taking that data to sending that data and combining it with data from SQL Server, say that we want to pass that value to a web service like this. Now, if these two data sources are compatible, if the Excel data source has its data privacy level set to public, then yes, I can take the value Tuesday from here, construct a URL with a day name parameter, and send it to the web service. But I can only do that if the Excel data source has its data source set to public, or if the Excel data source and the web service are both set to organizational. If the Excel data source has its data privacy level set to private, then I will get this error. Because if you think about it, there is no way that I can call this web service with this parameter without taking that value Tuesday and sending it over to the web service. If I can't send the value from Excel to the web service as a parameter, I can't call the web service. And so I get an error. So this is the cause of the first type of data privacy level error. It happens when you have incompatible data sources. Let's see an example of this. So here, if we go back, if you remember, I've got selected day set to private. In the query here, I am calling a web service that allows me to search a UK government website for open data. And what I'm doing, if we focus in on the code here, is I'm calling the web service, and then I'm passing the day name as a query parameter to that web service. And because the data coming from this data source up here, this is the Excel workbook, is private, well, I can't send it, so I can't call the web service. So this is an example of where I will see an error. And the only way I can make this error go away is go to data source settings, go to selected day, edit permissions, set that to be public, click close and refresh, and I can now call the web service. That's just one of the errors though. There is a second error, which is much more difficult to understand and much more difficult to work around. Now, as I said, the Power Query engine tries to enforce these data privacy rules to control whether data can pass from one data source to another. There are situations, though, when the Power Query engine gets confused. It can't work out whether it's allowed to enforce the rules or not. Now, to give you some background, the Power Query engine, when a query is run, and any queries that it depends on is run, divides the steps in a query into things that are called partitions. And a partition is typically one or more steps in a query. You can't have a partition that crosses multiple queries, but it's one or more steps in a query, and there are rules about data with partitions. So typically, a partition just connects to either one data source or it combines data source together. And if we think about the query that I just showed, where we are sending data from Excel and that combining it with data from the dim date table in SQL Server, these are the two queries, these are the steps. And all of the steps in the day name value query will be combined into one partition. These three steps in the dim date query will combine into one partition. And then there will be a third partition, the filtered row step, which combines the data from here and from here. Now, up until recently, there was no way that allowed you to see where these partitions are created. The good news is, a couple of weeks ago, in one of the recent releases of Power BI, we had a new query diagnostics option that allows you to see these partitions. So if you go to Tools, you can see that we have these new query diagnostic options. And if I go to diagnostic options, I'll open up a new dialog. I have to check a box here to say I want to see data privacy partitions. And when I do that, and when I click, for example, diagnose step on this filtered rows step here, I will get something that looks like this, and I get a query with one row for each partition. The name of the partition is found by combining the name of the query with the name of the last step in the partition. And you can see, for example, here that for this partition, sorry, the day name one, I've got a list of access resources, which is the selected day file. Here, I can see the name of the SQL Server database that I'm connecting to. The filtered rows partition doesn't access the data directly, but it does reference these other two partitions, so you can see that here. This is still something that I'm learning to understand, and I'll blog about this at some point in the future. But you can see the partitions. Now, there is a very important rule that you have to understand with partitions. In order for Power Query to be able to do its job and understand whether data is allowed to flow from one data source to another, a partition may either access compatible data sources or reference other partitions, but it can't do both. Now, if you try to make it do both, you will see a second error message. This is the Formula Firewall error message that says this query references other queries or steps, so it may not directly access a data source. Please rebuild this data combination. This is an error message which is very difficult to work around. Let's see an example of this. Here is an example query that gives me this particular error message. If I open up the query editor for this, we'll see why it's doing it. So what I've got here is something similar to what I was doing in my previous demo, which is connecting to the dim date table and filtering by day name of week. But instead of doing this filtering in separate steps, what I've got is just a single step here. I've got a single step that says connect to the SQL Server database and at the same time filter by day name value. So this is a great example of a step that connects to a data source directly. That's what we're doing here. And in the same expression, in the same step, gets data from another data source. So this is why I'm getting the error here. The way to work around it in this case is quite easy. It's to do what we did before, which is to break the expression up into multiple steps. So here, instead of one step, I have 3 steps. Source connects to the database, DBO dim date gets the dim date data, and filtered rows applies the filtering. And because it's in 3 separate steps, the Power Query engine doesn't get confused and everything just works. There will be other cases, other situations where you run into problems like this as well. For example, I have a query here that returns the name of a file, which is an Excel workbook. I've got another query here that returns that same error, and I'm getting this error because, again, I am getting data from the file name query here, and I'm trying to use that to pass into Excel.workbook to get the name, get the contents of this second Excel file. It turns out that I can't split this into separate steps, but one way to work around this is instead of having a query like this that returns the name of the file name, if I turn this into an M function, which I do like this, then the query works okay. Another example where you may run into this is where, for example, I try to dynamically generate a SQL query. So there is an option with the SQL.database function to supply your own SQL query. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm saying select 2 columns from the dim date table and in my where clause say where English day name of week equals, and then I'm trying to dynamically generate this where clause with a value from another query. This gives me the same error message. There are two ways to work around this. First of all, I can work around this by, instead of calling a value which comes from another query, I can load the data from Excel inside the same query. So don't reference, bring all the logic to get the data from both data sources into the same query, and this error goes away. There is another way to work around this, where you can use the value.native query function, and value.native query allows you to pass parameters into a SQL query, like I'm doing here. So this is the value containing the day name from Excel. And because for whatever reason Power Query doesn't think this is a dynamic data source, it works okay. So there are always ways of working around this error, but it can be very frustrating and very difficult. Moving on from these two errors, there is something else you need to think about with data privacy. Evaluating these data privacy checks and applying them can lead to performance problems. So we've already seen that data privacy checks can stop query folding from taking place, even if the query itself runs. But even in that situation, there are going to be other problems that might occur. So for example, just evaluating the data privacy checks before the query even runs can take quite a long time. So if you've ever sat in the Power BI, inside Power BI Desktop, trying to run your queries, and your queries show that dialog box that comes up when a query is running, and you see that it shows evaluating for a very long time. One of the reasons why this may be taking a long time is because the data privacy checks are adding an extra overhead. And I've seen, a performance increase of up to 30% of the overall query execution time simply by turning off data privacy checks. Okay, so that's all I want to say about data privacy checks in Power BI Desktop. Something else to mention, though, is that the way data privacy settings work in the Power BI service can be a little bit different. The first thing to understand is that even though you have set data privacy levels in Power BI Desktop, when you publish your data set up to the Power BI service, those data privacy settings are not remembered. They are not retained. You have to go in to the Power BI portal and set them again. They either need to be set on a data source in the Manage Gateway screen, or for data sources that connect to cloud data sources, you have to click and edit them in the Edit Credentials dialog in a cloud data source. So if I go to my browser here I am in the data source settings dialog for a connection to Azure Data Lake Storage. If I click on Edit Credentials here, you can see that I've got a data privacy level set here. If I go up to here and go to Manage Gateways and click on my local SQL Server data source, you will find that I'm also able to set the data privacy level for my data sources here as well. So you might have something working in Power BI Desktop, but unless you've got the same data privacy levels set in the Power BI service, you may have a problem. It's also worth mentioning that there is no way to turn off data privacy checks really in the Power BI service. Now, there is a way for personal gateways if you're using an on-premises gateway to connect to a data source, but this is a registry setting. It is documented, but I don't recommend you do it because it turns off all data privacy checks for all data sources that go through the gateway. So I really don't recommend doing that. So you have to remember that even if you turn off data privacy levels in Power BI Desktop to make your query run, that will still not apply in the service. It's also worth mentioning another way to work around or control data privacy settings is that you could write a Power Query custom connector, because data privacy settings are not applied inside custom connectors. So one possible thing to work around some data privacy errors is to create a custom connector and combine your data in there. That would be a way of combining data with no data privacy levels applied. But if you're in that situation, there is an easier option. You have data flows instead. So it's very easy to take what you've done in the Power Query editor and copy and paste it up to a data flow inside the Power BI service. And the interesting thing about data flows is that data flows by default do not apply data privacy checks. So if you're having trouble working around a data privacy error, perhaps the easiest way of working around it is to take your Power Query query and turn it into a data flow. So if I go up to the browser here and we look in a data flow here, here's the Power Query editor for Power Query Online, and we go to options, project options. You will see that we have an option here which is checked automatically, allow combining data from multiple sources. This means that data privacy settings are turned off. If I want to turn them on, I have to deselect this option. So that's the first thing to understand with data flows, and that's an easy way of working around data privacy errors. Another thing to bear in mind is that if you have Power BI Premium, you have an extra bit of functionality called computed entities. Now, computed entities look like referenced queries inside Power Query, but they're not the same. So here is a query that connects to my day name value inside Excel, connects to SQL Server. Now, the computed entity here, it looks like it's doing the same thing, but it isn't really, because with computed entities, what happens is that the data from these two queries up here are loaded into Azure Data Lake storage. And here, when the data from those two data sources combined, we are not getting the data from the original data source, we are getting the data from the Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. That's something else to understand. Okay, that's the whole of my presentation. In summary, as you've probably learned, data privacy levels are very difficult. They're difficult to understand. They can be very confusing. They can be very difficult to work around. But the important thing is you must try to understand them, and you must not ever turn off data privacy checks in Power BI Desktop. Because if you do, remember, data might pass from one data source to another. Data might leave your organization. You might be breaking the law. You could lose your job. You could destroy your company. All kinds of bad things could happen. So try to understand data flow, data privacy levels. There are usually ways to understand it. And if all else fails, maybe data flows are the answer. Okay, that's it. And we've now got 5 minutes for questions, if anybody has questions. Does anybody have any questions?
So far, I've not seen many questions. So people don't hesitate. If you have some elements that is not clear for you, feel free to take the opportunity to have Chris Webb here today with us to ask him some questions. Anyway, if you do have questions that come up later, feel free to ask them in the cafe, in the Power BI track channel. Maybe if Chris is around or will be around later, he will be able to answer them. You are right on time, no problem. So far, no questions. Yes, you have one. Is there any documentation on partition on how they can cause that error? Yeah.
I'm glad you asked that. There is, but it's quite obscure. Let me find it for you. So data privacy is something that I've blogged about several times, but actually in terms of partitions, let me try to find it here. Here we go. So there is, and let me share my screen. There was a post last year by one of the developers on the Power Query team on the Power Query MSDN forum, TechNet forum, called Behind the Scenes of the Data Privacy Firewall, and that explains everything about partitions. It was written before query diagnostics were available, but it explains how these partitions are applied and what they mean for data privacy. So what I can do is I can put a link to this in the chat, and you can read it in your own time if you want.
Okay,
but like
nice.
I said, we can now understand all of this. When this was written, there was no way to see the partitions. With query diagnostics, we now can see the partitions, and I'm currently kind of spending some time trying to understand what the query diagnostics gives us to try and actually help people diagnose these errors. So when I've finished all my research, I will blog about it.
Yeah, because I don't know for if it's the same case for everyone, but I do feel that the diagnostic tool is powerful, will help us understand some problems with our queries, but currently it's like a new toy that you don't have fully the notice to know how to go around it. I don't know if it's the case for.
I understand what you say completely.
Yeah, but seems to be a really powerful tool, but currently we don't have a lot of experience to be sure that we can use it that way or another way.
Exactly, and I think what's happening is we Microsoft are giving you the raw data first, and then once we've got the raw data, we're going to try to improve the tools to allow you to do something useful with the raw data.
Yeah, which is, on my opinion, this is personal, but is quite a good way to approach that, because at least give us stuff we are able to well, if we have the means and the capability to use that, we can do stuff on our own, and then I'm pretty sure that you have a team that will maybe develop some new tools that will maybe in one button we will have some error that will be shown easily. I don't know how you can exploit that, but we got the information. No, it's
Exactly.
really interesting. Really nice. Okay. Well, if there is no more questions, I think we can wrap up the session. Thank you again, Chris. It was really like Tristan said in the in the chat, really happy to have you here at our events, and it was really insightful. Thank you again, and maybe we will meet again in better circumstances currently.
Yes, I hope so. Well, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to present.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Great.
Have a good day.
And you.
So yeah, everyone, feel free to go to the Power BI channel. The cafe also is still there. Feel free to ask questions, to maybe try to see other subjects about that. And then the next session will be in 15 minutes. And the next is about Power Apps and Power BI, the SVG files within the Power Apps and Power BI. Sure, it will be great. Thank you again, Chris, and have a good day.
And
bye.
You. Thank you. Bye-bye.